Dorothy had once felt the warmth of Eric's love. He would shower her with compliments, calling her beautiful, graceful, and full of life. They were a happy couple even after their marriage, but everything changed when Dorothy found out she was pregnant. At first, Eric seemed thrilled. He held her close, whispered sweet words, and promised to be there every step of the way. But as her body started to change, so did Eric. Dorothy noticed the way his eyes would linger on her differently. His compliments turned into complaints. "You're gaining weight, Dorothy," he would say, his voice cold. "You are not the same anymore." Dorothy, overwhelmed with the changes happening in her body, tried to brush it off. "It's just the pregnancy, Eric. I'm carrying 2 babies," she would explain, trying to make him understand. She hadn't expected how challenging the pregnancy would be, but she was doing her best. When the twins were born, everything became harder. She was exhausted, trying to care for the 2 babies without any help. Eric's mother refused to come and assist her, saying she didn't support their marriage, and Dorothy had no family to turn to. She felt alone in a world full of people. One evening, as Dorothy looked at her reflection in the mirror, she sighed. Her stomach had stretch marks now, and her face felt bare without makeup. She longed for her old self. "I look so different," she said to herself, rubbing her tired eyes. Eric walked into the room and glanced at her, his face twisted with disappointment. "You look ugly now, Dorothy," he said, his voice harsh. "You have let yourself go. Look at your stomach, those marks, and no makeup. You don't even try anymore." Dorothy's heart sank. "I have just had twins, Eric. It's not easy. I don't have anyone to help me. I'm doing everything I can for our girls, and your mother has refused to come over." But Eric didn't listen. His frustration poured out, cutting her deeply. "Don't talk about my mother, she's not your problem," he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "You only have 2 babies. Look at yourself. You're nothing like the woman I married. You're ugly now." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. She didn't know what had happened to the man she had once loved. The man who used to tell her she was beautiful, now saw her as nothing but someone who had failed him. She wanted to scream, to tell him that she was struggling, that it wasn't easy to be a new mother with no support, but instead, she stayed silent. Every day felt harder. Dorothy started to lose herself in the whirlwind of motherhood. She could no longer remember the woman she had once been, the woman who smiled brightly, laughed without care, and felt beautiful in her own skin. Instead, she became someone she barely recognized. One day, as she was feeding the twins, Dorothy heard a knock on the door. She wondered who it could be. She had no friends nearby, and Eric was out. Always working. She wiped her tears quickly, stood up, and opened the door. To her surprise, it was her neighbor, Mrs. Johnson. The older woman smiled warmly. "I thought you might need some help," she said, her eyes kind. "I've made some food for you and thought I could lend a hand with the babies. You have been through so much, Dorothy." Dorothy felt a rush of gratitude, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like someone cared. She let Mrs. Johnson inside, and they sat together, talking about the struggles of being a mother. Meanwhile, Eric arrived home, and when he saw Mrs. Johnson, his face darkened. "Why is she here?" he demanded, his voice cold. "She's helping me, Eric," Dorothy replied quietly, "something you've refused to do." Eric's eyes narrowed. "I don't need her help, and you don't need to be asking for it. Get your act together, Dorothy." But Dorothy was tired. She was tired of trying to please him, of feeling like she wasn't enough. For the first time, she found the strength to stand up for herself. "I can't keep living like this, Eric," she said firmly. "I'm doing my best. I'm a mother now. I'm tired, but I'm trying. If you can't see that, then maybe you're the one who has changed, not me." The silence in the room was thick. Eric did not say anything, but Dorothy could see the conflict in his eyes. The next morning, Dorothy woke up feeling more tired than usual. The twins had kept her up most of the night, crying and needing to be fed. Her body ached, and her heart felt heavy after the argument with Eric. She decided to do something she hadn't tried in a while, call Eric's mother. Maybe, just maybe, she thought, his mother could talk to him or even agree to help her with the twins. Dorothy had always hoped to build a good relationship with her mother-in-law, even though she knew the woman had never liked her. She dialed the number with shaky hands, her heart pounding in her chest as the phone rang. "Hello," came the sharp voice on the other end. "Good morning, Ma," Dorothy said softly, trying to sound respectful. "It's me, Dorothy." There was a long pause, then came a curt reply, "What do you want?" Dorothy swallowed the lump in her throat. "I wanted to ask if you could please talk to Eric. Things have been really hard since the twins arrived. I'm struggling to take care of them on my own, and I was hoping you might come over to help me. I know it's not easy, but I really need support right now." The silence that followed was cold and suffocating. Finally, Eric's mother spoke, her words like venom. "Help you," she hissed. "I told Eric not to marry you, but he refused to listen. Why would I help an orphan who killed her own parents? You're nothing but bad luck, Dorothy, a witch." Dorothy froze, her heart felt like it had stopped beating. "What?" she stammered, her voice breaking. Trembling. "Ma, I have done nothing but love your son and respect you. Why would you say such things about me?" Eric's mother laughed bitterly. "You think I don't know who you are? Your kind brings nothing but sorrow. I lost my husband because of you. I will never step foot in that house, and the earlier you understand that, the better. I don't like you, Dorothy, and I never will." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. She clutched the phone tightly, desperate to make her case. "Ma, I've always tried to please you. I've done nothing wrong. All I want is for us to have peace. I'm not a witch, and I didn't kill my parents. Please, I'm begging you, I need your help." But the older woman wasn't moved. "You can beg all you want, but it won't change a thing. I told you I wasn't in support of this marriage, and I never will be. You are on your own, Dorothy." With that, she hung up, leaving Dorothy staring at the phone, the sound of the call ending echoing in her ears. Dorothy dropped the phone and slumped onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. Her sobs filled the empty room, and her heart ached like never before. "What have I ever done to deserve this?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "I have tried so hard to be a good wife, a good mother, and a good daughter-in-law. Why does she hate me so much?" She wished her parents were still alive. They would have held her, comforted her, and told her everything would be okay. But they were gone, taken from her in a car accident when she was just a teenager. She had spent her life longing for their love and guidance, and now, when she needed them the most, they weren't there. Dorothy cried for what felt like hours. The twins stirred in their crib, their tiny whimpers pulling her back to reality. Wiping her tears, she stood up and walked over to them, picking them up one by one, holding them close to her chest. "I will be strong for you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Even if the world is against me, I will fight for you both. You are my joy, my reason to keep going." That evening, Dorothy was sitting quietly in the living room when she heard the front door open. Eric walked in, laughing loudly, followed by a tall, elegant woman. The woman's bright red dress fit her perfectly, and her makeup was flawless. Her smile lit up the room as she glanced around confidently. Eric noticed Dorothy and immediately spoke up. "Oh, Candy, meet Dorothy," he said with a casual grin. "She's my cousin." Poor thing, her husband chased her out of the house because she gave birth to girls instead of boys. Dorothy's heart sank. She stared at Eric in disbelief, her lips trembling. "Cousin? Girls instead of boys?" Her mind raced, but she forced a small, polite smile. Candy extended her hand. "Oh, Dorothy, nice to meet you. I can't imagine what you must be going through," she said sweetly. Dorothy shook her hand weakly. "Nice to meet you too," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric didn't wait for further conversation. "Candy will be staying with us for a while," he said nonchalantly, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. He turned back to Candy with a wide smile. "Come, baby, let me show you to your room," he said, completely ignoring Dorothy's hurt expression. He led Candy down the hallway, chatting and laughing as if nothing was wrong. Dorothy stood frozen in the living room, her fists clenched at her sides, her thoughts spinning, her heart aching. Dorothy turned and stormed into the kitchen, her hands trembling. How dare he? How could he lie so blatantly in their own home? Minutes later, Eric walked into the kitchen, whistling as if he hadn't just shattered her dignity. He opened the fridge to grab a drink, but before he could leave, Dorothy stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Eric," she said, her voice low but firm, "what is the meaning of this? What's your problem?" he replied, not even looking at her. "Why did you introduce me to that woman as your cousin?" Dorothy asked, her voice trembling with a mix of hurt and anger. "And why would you lie that my husband chased me out because I gave birth to girls? What are you trying to do?" Eric finally looked at her, raising an eyebrow. "Candy is my guest," he said simply. "What does it matter how I introduced you? Don't embarrass yourself by making this a big deal." Dorothy felt her anger rise. "A big deal? You brought another woman into our home, lied about who I am, and you're acting like it's nothing?" Eric sighed and leaned on the counter, his face hardening. "If you must know, Candy is my girlfriend." He stared at her, daring her to react. "She's everything you're not: beautiful, fashionable, and classy." Dorothy's voice broke as tears filled her eyes. "Your girlfriend in our house, Eric? How could you do this to me?" Eric shrugged, his tone cold. "If you don't like it, you're free to leave. Take your daughters and go." Dorothy stared at him, stunned. "Leave? You know I have nowhere to go, Eric. You stopped me from working, remember? I don't have any money, any family. This family is all I have." Eric scoffed. "You think I'm the problem? You've given me nothing but daughters. I've always wanted a son, Dorothy. What use are girls to me?" Dorothy's anger boiled over. "How dare you blame me? It's what you put in me that I gave birth to. I've given you everything, Eric, and this is how you treat me. You and your mother have done nothing but frustrate me. Don't you dare bring my mother into this," Eric snapped, his voice rising. "She's not your problem. You are your own problem." Dorothy shook her head, her tears falling freely. "This is not the life you promised me. You said you would love and protect me. You said we would be a family." Eric's eyes flashed with anger. "Enough, Dorothy. If you want to stay in this house, you will keep quiet and mind your business. Don't push me." He stormed out of the kitchen, leaving Dorothy standing there, broken and overwhelmed. She wiped her tears, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. When Eric entered the guest room, Candy was already sitting on the edge of the bed, flipping through her phone. She looked up and smiled at him. "What kept you so long?" she asked sweetly. "Oh, nothing important," Eric said quickly, brushing off the question. "Just sorting a few things." Candy tilted her head. "Chem, I hope your cousin isn't a problem. She looks rough." Her tone carried a hint of mockery. Eric chuckled. "Don't worry about her. Dorothy knows her place. She'll do whatever I ask her to do." He leaned against the door frame, crossing his arms. "In fact, if you need anything tomorrow while I'm at work, just let her know. She has no choice but to help you." Candy's eyes sparkled mischievously. "Are you sure she won't complain? She doesn't seem happy about me being here." "She won't dare," Eric said firmly. "Dorothy knows better than to argue with me. If you need food, errands run, or anything else, just tell her. That's why she's here." Candy laughed lightly. "You're really something, honey. It's nice to know you are in control." Eric smiled. "Always, baby. Now, relax and make yourself at home. This is your place now." Meanwhile, Dorothy sat in the corner of the bedroom she shared with her daughters, tears streaming down her face. She could hear Eric and Candy laughing from the guest room, their voices loud enough to remind her of her pain. Her twins, now asleep beside her, were the only comfort she had left. She gently stroked their soft cheeks and whispered, "I'm sorry, my loves. Mommy will figure this out." But deep inside, Dorothy felt trapped. Eric's betrayal, his harsh words, and his cruel actions weighed heavily on her heart. She wiped her tears, determined to survive for the sake of her daughters. The next morning, Eric left for work early. Dorothy was in the kitchen washing dishes when she heard Candy's voice behind her. "Hey, Dorothy," Candy said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "I need you to go to the supermarket and get me a few things. Eric said you're here to help, so make yourself useful." Dorothy looked up, her expression calm but firm. "Are you okay?" Here's the story with added punctuation. What about my girls? Who's going to watch them while I'm running around for you? Candy rolled her eyes. That's your business, not mine. My baby said, you should do whatever I ask. If you don't like it, maybe you should think about leaving his house. Dorothy snapped. She stood up, holding the spoon in her hand. Listen, Candy, I am not your maid, and I won't be running around doing errands for you. If you need something, you can go get it yourself. Candy's face turned red with anger. How dare you talk to me like that? Eric will hear about this. She stormed out of the kitchen and into her room, slamming the door behind her. Minutes later, Candy was on the phone with Eric, her voice loud and full of fake tears. Baby, can you believe what your so-called cousin just said to me? I asked her to help me, and she insulted me. She said she's not my maid and refused to go to the supermarket. Eric's voice on the other end was sharp. What? She said that? Don't worry, Candy, I will deal with her when I get home. She's getting out of control. Candy smiled as she ended the call, feeling victorious. Meanwhile, Dorothy sat back down, her heart heavy with frustration. She had time to collect her thoughts when the doorbell rang. She got up to answer it and found Mrs. Johnson standing there with a concerned look on her face. Dorothy, what's going on? Mrs. Johnson asked as she stepped inside. You sounded upset when we spoke last night. Tell me everything. Dorothy sighed and led Mrs. Johnson to the living room, explaining everything. Eric bringing Candy into the house, introducing her as his girlfriend, and now expecting her to take orders from Candy. Mrs. Johnson's face darkened with anger. What? He brought another woman into your home, and now she's bossing you around? I can't believe this. She stood up abruptly. Where is she? I will teach her a lesson. Dorothy quickly grabbed Mrs. Johnson's arm, shaking her head. No, please don't. I will handle it. I don't want any more drama. Mrs. Johnson sighed heavily but sat back down, fuming. Dorothy, I won't lie to you, you've made this too easy for Eric. You see why I told you to get a job? If you were working, he wouldn't dare treat you like this. He knows you have nowhere to go, and is taking advantage of that. Dorothy looked down, tears filling her eyes. But he asked me to stop working. He said he wanted me to focus on our family. Mrs. Johnson shook her head. And you agreed? Oh, Dorothy, love is a beautiful thing, but it can also blind you. Now you see the truth. Men are not to be trusted completely. As a woman, you need to have something of your own, something no one can take away from you. You need to stand on your own 2 feet. Dorothy wiped her tears and nodded slowly. You're right, Mrs. Johnson. I see it now, but what do I do? I feel so trapped. Mrs. Johnson leaned forward, gripping Dorothy's hand tightly. You start by standing up for yourself. Don't let Candy walk all over you, and don't let Eric think he can control you forever. You have your daughters to fight for. You're stronger than this. Dorothy took a deep breath, her heart aching but her resolve hardening. I will try. I will figure out a way. Just then, Candy walked into the living room, her expression smug. Oh, I see you have company. Don't let me interrupt your little gossip session, she said with a fake smile. Mrs. Johnson's eyes flashed with anger, but Dorothy grabbed her arm again. It's okay, Mrs. Johnson. Let her say whatever she wants. I will deal with her. Mrs. Johnson stood up, glaring at Candy. Dorothy, you are too kind for your own good. If it were me, I'd throw her out, but I will respect your wishes. Just know I'm here if you need me. As Mrs. Johnson left, Candy twisted her lips at Dorothy. What's wrong? Did you tell your little friend about me too? Too bad she can't help you. Dorothy took a deep breath, her hands trembling. Candy, enjoy this while you can. It won't last forever. Candy laughed and walked away. That evening, Eric stormed into the house, slamming the door shut behind him. Candy sat on the couch, looking smug, her legs crossed as she waited for him. Baby, she said sweetly, you won't believe what happened while you were at work. That Mrs. Johnson came by again, acting all high and mighty. I think she's the one giving Dorothy the courage to disrespect you. She was here for a long time, probably filling Dorothy's head with nonsense. Eric's jaw tightened, his fists clenching. "Is that so?" he muttered. "I will deal with her once and for all." Candy smiled, her confidence boosted now that she had fueled his anger. Eric headed straight for the kitchen where Dorothy was stirring a pot of soup on the stove. The delicious aroma filled the air, but it did nothing to calm his rising temper. He stopped at the doorway, glaring at her. "So, Mrs. Johnson was here again today? Is she the one teaching you to be disrespectful?" Dorothy looked up, startled by his sudden presence. "Mrs. Johnson came to see me as a friend." "What's wrong with that?" Eric stepped closer, his voice dripping with venom. "What's wrong is that she's filling your head with foolish ideas. She's fooling you into thinking you have a say in this house. Look at you, standing there, acting like you matter." Dorothy's hands tightened around the spoon she was holding, her heart pounding in her chest. "Eric, I have told you before, Mrs. Johnson is my friend. She came to support me because, unlike you, she actually cares about what I'm going through." Eric let out a bitter laugh. "Going through what exactly? Are you going through? You've turned into an ungrateful woman. Look at yourself, stretch marks all over your stomach, no makeup, no effort. You've let yourself go completely, and now you think you can stand there and talk back to me." Dorothy felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a mix of anger and humiliation. She pointed the spoon at him. "You're unbelievable, Eric. You brought another woman into our home. And you expect me to be okay with it? You're nothing but a manipulative fool, just like your mother." The mention of his mother made Eric snap. His face twisted with rage as he raised his hand and slapped Dorothy hard across her cheek. The sound echoed through the kitchen, and Dorothy stumbled back, holding her face in shock. For a moment, there was silence, the air thick with tension. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She straightened herself, her voice trembling but firm. "You've changed, Eric. This isn't the man I married. You promised to love and protect me, but all you've done is hurt me. You've turned into someone I don't even recognize." Eric sneered. "And you've turned into a failure. You're lucky I even let you stay here. If it weren't for the twins, I would have thrown you out a long time ago." Dorothy's chest tightened, but she refused to back down. "You're a coward, Eric. You hide behind your mother and that woman in the living room, but one day, you will regret all of this." He took a step closer, his voice low and threatening. "Don't test me, Dorothy. You're walking on thin ice." At that moment, a soft cry came from the twins' room. The sound broke the tension, reminding Dorothy of her strength. She turned away from him, wiping her tears quickly, and walked out of the kitchen toward her daughters. Eric stood there, his chest heaving with anger, but somewhere deep down, a flicker of guilt tugged at him. He shook it off, storming back to the living room where Candy sat, pretending not to have heard anything. Dorothy, meanwhile, sat in the twins' room, holding her girls close. She whispered softly to them, more to herself than to them, "One day, we will be free from this. I promise you." Her tears fell silently, but in her heart, a fire was growing. She wasn't going to let Eric or anyone else break her completely. For her daughters, she would find a way to rise again. The next morning, Eric woke up still seething with anger. After getting dressed in his sharpest suit, he left the house without a word to Dorothy or even Candy. He had one destination in mind, Mr. Johnson's house. When Eric arrived, Mr. Johnson was in the garden, pruning some flowers. He looked up and saw Eric approaching, his face tense with irritation. Mr. Johnson sat down his clippers and folded his arms. "What do you want, Eric?" Mr. Johnson asked, his tone calm but firm. Eric didn't waste time. "I'm here to warn you about your wife. She has no business meddling in my family matters. Tell Mrs. Johnson to stay away from Dorothy and my home. She's filling Dorothy's head with lies and making her more disrespectful. She needs to mind her own business." Mr. Johnson raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Oh, so now you think my wife is the problem? Let me tell you something, Eric, the only problem in your home is you." Eric's fists clenched. "Watch your words, Mr. Johnson. You don't know what's happening in my house." Mr. Johnson took a step closer, his voice dripping with disappointment. I don't need to know every detail, Eric. It's obvious you're not man enough to handle your responsibilities. You bring another woman into your house while your wife is raising your children? Do you even hear how ridiculous you sound? Look at me, 10 years of marriage, and I've never disrespected my wife like that. A real man doesn't act the way you do. Eric's face turned red with anger. You don't know anything about my life, so don't lecture me. Mr. Johnson shook his head, a look of disgust on his face. You're nothing but a foolish mummy's boy, Eric, always running to your mother instead of solving your own problems. When are you going to grow up and be a real man? The words stung, hitting Eric like a slap across the face. He pointed an accusing finger at Mr. Johnson. You'd better warn your wife to stay out of my business, or I will make sure she regrets it. Mr. Johnson laughed coldly. Get out of my house, Eric. You're not worth another minute of my time. Eric stormed off, slamming the gate behind him. As he got into his car, he was still fuming. He grabbed his phone and called his mother, gripping the steering wheel tightly as it rang. When she picked up, her voice was cheerful. Eric, my son. How are you not good, Mema? He said angrily. You won't believe what just happened. Mrs. Johnson has been interfering in my marriage, and now her husband had the nerve to insult me. He called me a foolish mummy's boy and said I'm not man enough to have a family. His mother's cheerful tone quickly turned cold. What? That woman has gone too far. Don't worry, my son, I will handle this myself. I will come over tomorrow and put Dorothy in her place. She's the one allowing these people to insult you. Eric sighed, a small smile creeping onto his face. Thank you, Mama. I knew I could count on you. His mother continued, her voice sharp. Dorothy needs to understand that this is our family, and if she doesn't like it, she can leave. I have never liked that girl anyway. She's ungrateful and unworthy of you. I agree, Mama, Eric said, his confidence growing. I will be waiting for you tomorrow. As he hung up, Eric felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. In his mind, he believed his mother would set everything right, but deep down, a tiny voice whispered that things were spiraling out of control. The following morning, Eric's mother arrived at the house with an air of authority. She went straight to the kitchen where Dorothy was cooking food for the family. The smell of soup filled the air, but Eric's mother didn't care. Dorothy, she shouted. Dorothy turned around. Good morning, Mama, she said, trying to be polite. Don't call me Mama, Eric's mother said angrily. Look at you, fat, ugly, and useless. Is this what a wife should look like? My son made the biggest mistake by marrying you. Dorothy's heart hurt, but she tried to stay calm. Mama, I don't know what I did to make you hate me so much. I try my best. I cook, I clean, and I take care of my children. Your best is not good enough, Eric's mother shouted. You are a shame to this family. Look at your body, full of stretch marks, no makeup, always in the kitchen. My son deserves a better wife than you. Dorothy took a deep breath, trying to hold back her tears. Mama, I have done nothing wrong. I take care of this house and my children. I don't know why you dislike me so much. I don't like you because you are nothing, Eric's mother screamed. I told my son not to marry you. You have no family, no class, and no beauty. If you can't live here quietly, you should leave this house. Dorothy looked at her with tears in her eyes. Mama, I have nowhere to go. You know I don't have a family. This is my home too. Please, don't make things harder for me. Eric's mother slammed her hand on the kitchen counter. You are lucky I even walked into this house. If it were up to me, you'd already be gone. You don't belong here. Dorothy's hand started shaking. She was trying so hard to stay calm. Mama, I respect you because you are Eric's mother, but if you keep insulting me, I will not stay silent. I have tried to be patient, but enough is enough. How dare you talk to me like that? Eric's mother screamed and raised her hand. Before Dorothy could move, she slapped her across the face. Dorothy held her cheek, her face burning with pain. She looked at Eric's mother, her voice shaking. You are lucky I have respect for elders, if not, you would regret this. But I will not let you break me. You think you can stand up to me? Eric's mother shouted. You are nothing, Dorothy. Nothing. Dorothy turned back to her pot, stirring the soup, her tears falling silently into the food. I will not leave this house, she said softly. This is my home too, and I will not abandon my children. If you have a problem with that, talk to your son. Eric's mother glared at her, breathing heavily. This is not over, she said before storming out of the kitchen. Dorothy stood there for a moment, holding the spoon tightly. Her cheek hurt, but she promised herself one thing: she would not give up. She had to stay strong for her daughters. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Johnson came to visit Dorothy. Dorothy was in the kitchen as usual, preparing lunch for the house when Mrs. Johnson walked in. She called out, "Dorothy, are you here?" Dorothy wiped her hands on her apron and came out of the kitchen, smiling. "Mrs. Johnson, welcome. How are you?" "I'm fine, my dear," Mrs. Johnson said with a warm smile. She looked at Dorothy closely. "But you, Dorothy, you look tired. Are you okay?" Dorothy sighed. "I'm trying, Mrs. Johnson. The work in this house is too much: cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the twins. But I am managing." Mrs. Johnson shook her head. "That's why I'm here. I have good news for you." Dorothy looked at her with surprise. "Good news? What is it?" "I found a job for you," Mrs. Johnson said with a big smile. "It's at a small office, not far from here. The pay is good, and the work is not too hard. You can start next month if you want." Dorothy's eyes widened with joy. "A job? Really? Oh, Mrs. Johnson, thank you so much." Mrs. Johnson nodded. "Yes, Dorothy. It's time for you to do something for yourself. Your twins are 6 months old now, so you can put them in a creche during the day. That way, you can work and earn your own money." Dorothy felt a wave of relief. She had been feeling trapped in the house with no money and no way to stand on her own. "This is wonderful, Mrs. Johnson. I don't even know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Mrs. Johnson said, smiling. "You have to talk to Eric about it first." Dorothy's smile faded a little. "Yes, I will have to tell him. I hope he will agree." Mrs. Johnson frowned. "Why should he not agree? It's your life, Dorothy. You need to do what is best for you and your children." Dorothy nodded slowly. "You are right. I can't keep living like this, depending on Eric for everything. I will talk to him tonight." "Good," Mrs. Johnson said firmly. "And if he gives you trouble, call me. I will come and talk sense into him." Dorothy laughed softly, feeling a bit lighter for the first time in months. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. You are like a mother to me. I don't know what I would do without you. You are like a daughter to me, Dorothy," Mrs. Johnson said. "And I want to see you happy and strong. Don't let anyone take away your happiness." Dorothy nodded, her heart filled with hope. For the first time, she felt like there was a way out of her struggles. She just had to find the courage to stand up for herself. That evening, Eric returned home looking tired and irritable. Dorothy quickly served him his dinner, placing the food on the table while he sat down. She hesitated, her heart pounding as she thought about how to bring up the job. After a moment, she took a deep breath and sat across from him. "Eric, I need to talk to you about something important," she said softly. He barely glanced at her as he started eating. "What is it now, Dorothy?" Dorothy clasped her hands together, trying to steady her nerves. "Mrs. Johnson found a job for me. It's at a small office not far from here. I can start next month." Eric stopped chewing and looked up, his face hardening. "A job? Why would you need a job?" Dorothy swallowed, her voice trembling. "Eric, I have been at home for so long. I need to do something for myself. The twins can go to a creche during the day, and I can start earning some money. It will help us." Eric slammed his fork down on the table, making her jump. "Help us? What do you mean by that? Don't I already provide everything you need? What more do you want, Dorothy?" She looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes. "Eric, it's not just about money. I feel stuck. I need to do something meaningful, something that makes me feel like I'm more than just a servant in this house." "A servant?" Eric sneered. "You are my wife, Dorothy. Your job is to take care of this house and our children. Who will clean? Who will cook for me if you go run off to some job? Dorothy took a deep breath and looked at Eric. Why are you saying who will clean and cook, Eric? What is Candy here for then? She's been in this house for days now, doing nothing. Why can't she help with something? Eric's eyes darkened with anger. Candy, are you out of your mind? Candy is too classy, too sophisticated to do any house chores. She's not like you, Dorothy. Dorothy stared at him, her heart sinking. Too classy to clean, cook, yet you think it's okay to overwork me every day? I take care of this entire house, I care for our daughters, and now you expect me to continue like this while someone else sits and does nothing? Watch your tone, Dorothy, Eric warned, pointing a finger at her. Don't compare yourself to Candy. She's not here to work, she's here because I want her here. You're the wife, this is your job. Dorothy's tears threatened to spill, but she forced herself to speak. I am not your maid, Eric. I'm your wife. You promised me a happy life, but all you've given me is pain and stress. I deserve some respect too. Eric laughed, shaking his head. Respect for what? Look at you, Dorothy. You can't even take care of yourself. You're lucky I haven't thrown you out of this house yet. Dorothy's heart broke at his cruel words. She clenched her fists, trying to keep her composure. You know what, Eric? Keep treating me like I'm nothing. One day, you'll regret it. He scoffed, turning away. The only thing I regret is marrying someone who can't understand her place. Do what I say, or you will have to leave. Dorothy watched him walk away, her chest tight with anger and sadness. She thought of her daughters sleeping peacefully in the other room. She couldn't let them grow up in a house filled with so much hate. She wiped her tears and whispered to herself, this is not the life I prayed for, but I won't give up. I will find a way to stand on my own. The next morning, Dorothy sat on the edge of her bed, her heart heavy from the argument with Eric the previous night. She felt trapped and hopeless, but she also remembered her quiet promise to herself to fight for a better life. She picked up her phone and dialed Mrs. Johnson's number. When her friend answered, Dorothy poured out everything that had happened, the insults from Eric, his refusal to let her work, and the growing burden she was carrying. Mrs. Johnson listened patiently, and when Dorothy finished, her friend sighed deeply. Dorothy, Mrs. Johnson said thoughtfully, it's time you start thinking about what you can do for yourself. I've been telling you this for years. You're a fantastic cook. Why don't you start cooking for events or parties? People are always looking for someone to cater for them. Dorothy's heart raced with both excitement and doubt. I don't know, Mrs. Johnson, she said hesitantly. I don't have any connections or anyone to help me. How would I even start? Mrs. Johnson's voice was firm. Leave that to me. One of my friends is having a small birthday get-together next week, just 15 guests. I'll tell her you can handle the food, but Dorothy, you have to promise me you won't disappoint. This could be your chance to start something great. Dorothy felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. Of course, Mrs. Johnson. I can do it. My girls are already going to creche, so I'll have the time to focus on it. I won't let you down. True to her word, Mrs. Johnson spoke to her friend, who agreed to give Dorothy the catering job. Over the next few days, Dorothy worked tirelessly. She planned the menu, shopped for the ingredients, and prepared everything with care and love. Each night, after putting her daughters to bed, she stayed up late perfecting every recipe. When the day of the party arrived, Dorothy delivered the food right on time. The aroma alone was enough to make mouths water. The guests began eating, and soon compliments filled the air. Who made this jollof rice? It's the best I've ever tasted, one guest exclaimed. The fried chicken is so crispy and flavorful, another added. Mrs. Johnson's friend beamed with happiness as she thanked Dorothy. You've outdone yourself, Dorothy. This food is amazing. I'm going to tell everyone about you. Dorothy smiled, her heart swelling with pride. For the first time in a long time, she felt valued and appreciated. True to her word, Mrs. Johnson's friend spread the news about Dorothy's cooking. Soon, more people started calling her for small jobs, birthday parties, baby showers, and even small weddings. Dorothy threw herself into the work, balancing her new career with caring for her daughters. Each successful event brought her more recognition, and with the money she earned, Dorothy was able to buy a few things for herself and her children without relying on Eric. One night, Eric came home tired from work. As he settled into the living room, Candy sat beside him, her arms crossed and a sly smile on her face. "I thought you said you didn't want Dorothy to work," Candy said casually, glancing toward the kitchen where Dorothy was cleaning up. "Yes, I said so," Eric replied. "She knows her place. She won't work." Candy leaned in closer, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, really? Because I've heard she's been quite busy lately, cooking for events around town. She's even making a name for herself. Maybe she doesn't need you as much as you think." Closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Then why is she always cooking so much food? Every time I see her, she's making dishes in bulk. Don't you find that strange?" Eric frowned. "She told me she's just helping out her friends for free. There's nothing to it." Candy shook her head, laughing softly. "You're too trusting, Eric. Look at her. Haven't you noticed she's been dressing better lately? She's even wearing makeup. Someone who isn't earning money wouldn't be able to afford all that. I think she's lying to you." Eric's face darkened. He sat up straight, her words stirring anger within him. "What are you trying to say?" "I'm saying you're so focused on me and your job that you're not paying attention. Dorothy is hiding something. I think she's secretly working and not telling you." Without another word, Eric stormed into the kitchen. Dorothy was wiping down the counter when he barged in, his face red with anger. "Dorothy," he barked. "What's going on here? Are you lying to me?" Dorothy turned around, startled by his sudden outburst. "What are you talking about, Eric?" "Don't play dumb," Eric shouted. "Candy says you've been cooking a lot of food. You told me it's for your friends, but now I'm hearing you might be working behind my back. Is that true?" Dorothy took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew the truth would only make things worse. "It's true, Eric. I've been cooking for my friends, but I'm not getting paid for it. I'm just helping them out." Eric's eyes narrowed. "Do you think I'm stupid? Look at how you're dressing these days. You think I wouldn't notice? Where are you getting the money to buy new clothes if you're not working?" Dorothy stood her ground. "I've saved a little from the allowance you give me, Eric. That's how I've been able to get a few things for myself." "You're lying," Eric shouted, slamming his hand on the counter. "You're foolish, Dorothy. You're slaving away in the kitchen for people who don't even pay you. What kind of woman are you?" Dorothy clenched her fists, holding back tears. "I'm doing it because I love to cook, Eric. It makes me happy, and it's the only thing keeping me sane in this house." "You're an embarrassment," Eric spat. "Laboring for free while I provide everything for you. You're pathetic." Dorothy looked at him, her eyes filled with hurt but also determination. "You can insult me all you want, Eric, but I'm not doing anything wrong. If helping people makes me pathetic, then so be it." Eric shook his head in disgust and stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. Dorothy leaned against the counter, tears streaming down her face. She felt humiliated and defeated. After Eric left for work the next morning, Dorothy decided she'd had enough. She walked to Candy's room, knocked on the door, and stepped inside without waiting for an answer. Candy was lying on the bed, scrolling through her phone. She looked up, surprised. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone sharp. Dorothy folded her arms and stared at her. "I've had enough of this nonsense," she said firmly. "Let me tell you something, Candy. Eric is my husband, not my cousin as he told you." Candy's jaw dropped. "What are you talking about?" "You heard me," Dorothy said, her voice steady. "I'm not some distant cousin. I'm the woman he married, the mother of his children. You're nothing but a lazy gold digger who thinks she can take my place." Candy sat up, her face filled with shock and anger. "So Eric lied to me," she whispered. Dorothy nodded. "Yes, he did. He lied to you, just like he lies to everyone. Everyone else he brought you into my home disrespected me, and expects me to stay quiet. Well, I won't anymore." Candy was furious. She grabbed her phone and called Eric immediately. You lied to me, she shouted as soon as he answered. You told me Dorothy was your cousin. She just came here and told me the truth. Eric, who was at work, froze. Candy, calm down, let me explain. No, I don't want to hear it, Candy cut him off. I'm done with you, Eric. I'm leaving. Wait, Candy, Eric begged. Please don't leave me. I love you. If you love me, Candy said coldly, then you'll do what I say. I want Dorothy out of that house today. If she stays, I'm gone. Eric panicked. Okay, don't leave. I'll handle it. He left work early and rushed home. Dorothy was in the kitchen when he came in, his face dark with anger. You have to leave, he said without even greeting her. Dorothy turned to him, unbothered. What are you talking about? I'm talking about you leaving this house, Eric said, his voice rising. Candy doesn't want you here. She said if you stay, she'll leave me. Dorothy chuckled softly, shaking her head. So now you're throwing me out for her after everything I've done for you? Just leave, Dorothy, Eric snapped. Take your girls and go. I don't want to hear anything else. Dorothy didn't beg him or argue, she had grown tired of his disrespect. Fine, she said, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. You'll regret this someday, Eric. Mark my words. She packed her belongings, took her daughters, and left. Luckily, she had saved enough money from her cooking jobs, and with Mrs. Johnson's help, she was able to rent a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. Over the next few weeks, Dorothy's life began to change. Word about her delicious cooking spread quickly, and she started getting contracts for bigger events, weddings, birthday parties, and even corporate functions. Her calendar was soon fully booked. She worked tirelessly but was happy with the growing demand. She even hired 2 assistants to help her with the cooking and deliveries. Her business grew faster than she had ever imagined. One evening, Mrs. Johnson visited her new apartment. Look at you now, Mrs. Johnson said with a proud smile. I told you, didn't I? You're strong, Dorothy. You don't need Eric or anyone else to succeed. Dorothy smiled back, tears in her eyes. Thank you for believing in me, Mrs. Johnson. I wouldn't have made it this far without you. As they sat together, Dorothy looked around her cozy apartment. It wasn't much, but it was hers. For the first time in years, she felt free. Meanwhile, back at Eric's house, his mother decided to visit. She arrived in the afternoon and sat in the living room for hours without anyone offering her food or drink. She looked around, annoyed. Eric wasn't home yet, and Candy was lounging in her room, scrolling through her phone. After waiting for a while, Eric's mother got up and went to Candy's room. She knocked and entered without waiting for a response. Candy, she said, standing with her arms crossed. I have been here for hours, and you haven't even bothered to cook for me. Is this how you behave? Candy looked up from her phone and laughed mockingly. Cook for you? Why should I? Why should you? Eric's mother repeated, her voice rising. When Dorothy was here, she would already be in the kitchen preparing something for me before I even asked. She respected me as her mother-in-law. Candy rolled her eyes. Don't you ever compare me to that low-class woman again, she snapped. I am not Dorothy, and I will never act like her. I am classy and don't do kitchen work like some housemaid. Eric's mother's jaw dropped. Classy, she said, her voice full of disbelief. You call this class? Let me tell you something, Candy. Dorothy had real class. She could cook, clean, and had manners. She treated me with respect. But you're just a gold digger. Candy stood up, furious. Gold digger? How dare you? Listen, old woman, in my life, don't you ever compare me to Dorothy again. That woman is beneath me. Eric's mother pointed a finger at her. You have no shame, Candy. My son will hear about this. When Eric comes home, I will tell him exactly what kind of woman you are. Candy laughed loudly. Go ahead and tell him, she said, smirking. Your foolish son won't believe you. Trust me, I control him now. He listens to me, not you. Eric's mother shook her head in disgust. You are unbelievable. Mark my words, Candy, your true colors will be exposed one day, and when that day comes, Don't expect me to stand by you. Candy sat back down and picked up her phone, dismissing her with a wave of her hand. Whatever. Close the door on your way out. Fuming, Eric's mother stormed out of the room, muttering to herself, "My son made the biggest mistake of his life bringing this woman into his home. She will ruin him. I can't wait for Eric to come back." As she sat in the living room, she thought about Dorothy and how things had been different when she was in the house. Despite her past dislike for Dorothy, she couldn't deny that she had treated Eric and his family with care and respect. Eric's mother began to regret how she had treated Dorothy and wondered if her son would ever realize the mistake he had made. Eric had just returned home after a long day at work, feeling tired and frustrated. As he stepped inside, the first person he saw was Candy, who was lounging on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, but there was a certain coldness in her smile. Before Eric could say anything, Candy quickly spoke up. "You won't believe what your mother did today," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "She came over and started talking badly about me, saying I'm not good enough for you. She's always been rude and disrespectful, honey. You know how much I love you." Eric stormed into his mother's room, his face red with anger. His footsteps echoed through the house as he slammed the door behind him. His mother, who had been sitting calmly, looked up in surprise. "What's going on, Eric?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Don't act like you don't know," Eric shouted. "I have had enough of this. You're doing it again. You are trying to ruin everything for me, just like you did with Dorothy." His mother stood up, her face filled with confusion. "What are you talking about? I didn't do anything wrong." "Yes, you did," Eric shouted. "You've been disrespectful to Candy, you've been talking behind her back, and now look at what you've done. You've forced me to choose between you and her, and you know I won't let that happen again." His mother's face turned pale. "Eric, I only want what's best for you. I never meant to hurt you or Candy." Eric wasn't listening, he was too angry, too upset to hear her. "Hear her? You always do this, you've always tried to control everything in my life. You pushed Dorothy out of this house, and now you're doing the same thing to Candy." He threw his hands up in frustration. "I won't let you do it again, Mother. You're the one who caused all of this." Without warning, Eric turned around and grabbed his mother's arm, pushing her toward the door. "Leave. You're not welcome here anymore. I don't want to see you near Candy again," he shouted. His mother's eyes filled with tears as she tried to pull away. "Eric, please, I'm your mother. I have always wanted the best for you." But Eric wouldn't listen, his face was twisted with anger and hurt. "You've done enough damage, Mother. I have made my decision. Candy is my future, and you need to leave." He shoved her out the door, and his mother stumbled, falling onto the cold ground outside. She sat there, shocked, tears streaming down her face. She had never imagined that her own son would push her away like this, not for Candy, a woman she thought was the best for him. As she sat on the ground, her heart ached with regret. She had never wanted things to get this bad, but now, as she watched Eric slam the door in her face, she knew that there was no turning back. She had lost him. Inside the house, Candy had been listening from the hallway. She heard the shouting, the insults, and the door slam. When Eric returned to the living room, she was already waiting, sitting on the couch with a smile on her face. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice dripping with sweetness. Eric, still fuming with anger, looked at her. "I can't believe what I just did. I pushed my own mother out of the house because of you." Candy stood up and walked toward him. "Well, it's about time you made a decision," she said smoothly. "Now we can move forward without anyone trying to control us." Eric, exhausted and defeated, nodded. "Yeah, I guess you're right," he muttered. He didn't know why he was feeling so empty, but something inside of him felt off. A few days later, Eric came home after a long day at work, his mind still heavy with the events of the past week. As he walked into the house, he found Candy sitting on the couch, her eyes glued to her phone, fingers scrolling rapidly across the screen. She didn't even look up as he entered. "Where's my food?" Eric asked, his voice tired but edged with frustration. Candy didn't even glance up. "You can cook it yourself," she said casually, tapping away on her phone. I've had a busy day too, you know. Eric's temper flared. Are you serious? I've been out working all day, and you're sitting here scrolling through your phone instead of taking care of the house? You can't even cook. I've asked you 100 times to help around here, and you don't do anything. Candy slowly looked up from her phone, her eyes narrowing. Oh, you think you're the only one working hard? I've been doing things around here too, and besides, you know exactly how I like to spend my time. It's not like you don't benefit from it, right? Eric's Dorothy wore thin. You've been sitting around all day doing nothing but talking to your friends online. I'm the one who goes to work to bring in money. I'm the one who does everything, and you sit around expecting me to cater to you like some kind of fool. Candy looked up at him. You're foolish, Eric. If you want food, go make it yourself. I'm not your servant, she said. Eric was angry. Candy, I'm tired. I've been working hard all day, and you can't even do something simple like cooking. This is not how it's supposed to be. Candy stood up slowly, a smile on her face. Fine, Eric. If you're not happy, maybe I should leave. I give you every sweetness you want in bed, don't I? You know how much you like that. Eric was even more frustrated. Is that all you think you do for me? He said, shaking his head. I need more than that. I need you to help, to share things with me. Candy paused and looked at him. Okay, I'm sorry, she said. I will do better. I just don't feel like I have to do everything. You know. Eric ran a hand through his hair. He was tired, and his Dorothy was running thin. Look, I don't want to argue about this anymore. I'm sorry I got angry, but I don't expect to come home every day and find you doing nothing while I work all day. I'll cook today, but this better not happen again, he said firmly, turning toward the kitchen. Candy watched him for a moment, then grinned. That's my boy, she said, as if everything was now fine. Good boy. Months passed, and with all the big contracts Dorothy was getting, her life was changing for the better. She had worked hard, and now she was reaping the rewards. She had saved enough money to buy a comfortable house in a peaceful neighborhood. It wasn't just a home, it was a place where her daughters could grow up happily. The house was spacious with a beautiful garden and a cozy living room. Dorothy's business was booming. She had moved into a larger restaurant and expanded her catering services. More people were coming to her for her delicious meals. Dorothy felt proud of what she had built. It had been a long journey, but now she was in control of her life. Her restaurant was one of the best in town, and people loved the food she served. She could finally see the fruits of her hard work. She never forgot Mrs. Johnson, the woman who had helped her so much. Dorothy called her one day to thank her for everything she had done. Mrs. Johnson, I just want to say thank you. Without you, I don't know where I would be. You helped me when I had nothing, and I will always be grateful, Dorothy said. Mrs. Johnson smiled over the phone. You deserve all the success, Dorothy. You worked hard for it. I'm proud of you, she said. A few days later, Dorothy's phone rang. She picked it up, and to her surprise, it was Eric's mother. Her voice trembled on the other end. Dorothy, it's me. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I've been thinking about everything, and I know I treated you badly. I regret what I did. Please, can you forgive me? Dorothy paused. She had never expected to hear those words. Eric's mother had been cruel to her when she was married to Eric, but now Dorothy had found peace in her life, and she wasn't angry anymore. Still, it was a hard choice. With a calm voice, Dorothy replied, I've forgiven you, but I can't forget the things that happened. I've moved on with my life, and I'm doing well. I wish you all the best, but I can't help you with everything you want. Eric's mother didn't respond right away. I understand, she said softly. Can I see my granddaughters at least? I've missed them so much. Dorothy's heart softened, but she shook her head, even though Eric's mother couldn't see her. I'm sorry, but no. It's better this way. I have to protect my girls. Maybe someday, but not now, Dorothy said. She could hear Eric's mother sigh on the other end of the line. I understand, she said again. Thank you for hearing me out, Dorothy. Without saying another word, Dorothy hung up the phone. As she sat there, She thought about everything she had been through. It hadn't been easy, but she had survived. Now she was stronger than ever. She had a successful business, a beautiful home, and her 2 lovely daughters. Dorothy smiled, feeling proud of how far she had come. One day, Eric. The kitchen with Candy following closely behind. Look at this place, the house is a mess. You don't cook or clean, and I'm getting tired of doing everything myself. I'm always cooking, buying fast food. I can't keep doing this, Candy. Candy, who was sitting on the couch, looked up at him, clearly annoyed but not saying much. Eric was getting angrier by the second. He couldn't hold back anymore. I've had enough. I'm hosting some business partners this weekend, and I expect you to cook for them. They are important people, Candy. Don't embarrass me. Candy reluctantly sighed. Fine, I'll do it, she said, not looking up from her phone. She was tired of the constant complaints but didn't want to make things worse. But you better not expect me to do everything, she muttered under her breath. Eric, still angry, shook his head. It's not about doing everything, Candy. It's about contributing. You don't even help around here. I'm the one who does all the work. You can at least cook for one day for my business partners. Candy stood up and threw her phone down, facing him. I will do it, but I'm not doing it with a smile on my face. You don't even appreciate what I do for you in bed. Eric didn't respond, he just walked away, leaving Candy feeling both frustrated and helpless. She knew he was upset, but she didn't feel like he understood how much she was already doing or how much she was giving up. Still, she had no choice. She had to cook, even if it meant doing it reluctantly. The weekend came, and Candy started preparing for the event. She was determined to make the food taste good, but deep down, she felt resentment building. She was tired of trying to live up to Eric's high expectations. Candy stood in the kitchen, stirring the food with a heavy heart. She had been up all morning preparing, but as she tasted the dish, she frowned. It didn't taste right. It was bland, not what she had hoped for. Eric's business partners were arriving soon, and the pressure was on. She needed everything to go perfectly, but the taste just wasn't right. After thinking for a moment, she decided to fix it her way. She added a generous amount of sugar and honey, hoping it would sweeten things up. She stirred it in, feeling a sense of satisfaction, but deep down, she knew it wasn't the right way to do things. Still, she convinced herself that it would be fine. When the guests arrived, Candy greeted them with a bright smile, trying to keep her composure. The room filled with chatter and laughter, but she couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety. She served the food, watching closely as the guests tasted it. The moment their faces twisted in disgust, Candy's heart sank. One of the guests put his fork down and looked at Eric, saying, "This is not what we feed Eric when we host him." "What is this?" The other guests murmured in agreement, clearly disappointed. Eric's face turned red with embarrassment, his eyes darting around the room, trying to avoid the awkwardness. He stood up, his anger bubbling over. "What is this?" Eric shouted, storming into the kitchen. Answered, her voice calm but curious. "Eric, what's going on?" Eric took a deep breath, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Mrs. Johnson, I've made a terrible mistake. I've lost everything. I treated Dorothy horribly, and now she's gone. Candy is gone too, and I don't know what to do. I need help. Could you please help me?" Mrs. Johnson was silent for a moment, processing what Eric had just said. Then she spoke, her tone measured but firm. "Eric, what you did to Dorothy was wrong. She deserved better. But if you're truly sorry, if you want to make amends, you need to understand that it's not just about apologizing. It's about changing. Dorothy has built a new life for herself, one where she's happy and successful. She might not want to see you again, and you must respect that." Eric's voice cracked as he responded, I know I've been awful. I just want to make things right. I want to at least try to apologize, to show I've changed." Mrs. Johnson sighed. "I can't promise anything, Eric. Dorothy has moved on. But if you're sincere, if you genuinely want to change, then perhaps there's a chance. I'll talk to her, but you must prepare yourself for the possibility that she might not want to see you or hear from you." "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson." "Thank you," Eric said, his voice thick with emotion. He knew he had a lot to prove, not just to Dorothy but to himself. He had to change, to become the kind of person who didn't take others for granted, who valued the love and support he once had. Days passed, and Eric waited anxiously for any word from Mrs. Johnson. He started to make changes in his life. He cleaned the house, learned to cook, and even began volunteering at a local shelter, trying to find purpose and atonement in his actions. Finally, Mrs. Johnson called back. "Eric, I spoke with Dorothy. She's willing to meet you, but it's not for reconciliation. She wants to hear your apology, to see if you've truly changed. But understand, this is her closure, not a new beginning." Eric felt a mix of hope and despair. He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I understand. Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. I'll do whatever it takes to show I've changed." The meeting was set for a neutral place, a small cafe in town. When Eric saw Dorothy, he was struck by how much